Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. We're going to start our conversation about markets and end users. So we're finally really beginning the process of working through the disciplined entrepreneurship process. We're beginning by thinking about market segments and the beachhead market, and we'll continue on with aspects of the end user profile and ultimately the persona. So it's really important to start with the understanding that all viable businesses have paying customers. You can't really run a business where you have no paying customers forever. I understand that there have been many examples of high-tech successful ventures like Facebook that started out without paying customers. After all, it's free to join Facebook and you never have to actually pay for anything. But ultimately, even organizations like Facebook had to generate revenues. And I, for one, remember the time when Facebook began announcing that they were going to use ads as their mechanism for generating revenue. And it was, in fact, very controversial at the time. Many people quit Facebook at that point. That might seem incredible now, since so much of what we do online is driven by advertising revenue. But you can easily go back and look at the news stories to see exactly when it happened and what the reaction was. The point is that as you evaluate an opportunity, you really should have a target customer in mind. And a group of your potential target customers is what we call your target market segment. So right now, what I'd like you to do is open up the Canvas activity for this particular topic. And there's a series of questions you're going to ask as we go through, answer as we go through these videos. The first one is quite simple. I simply would like you to talk about whether you think it's better to target an existing market or to create an entirely new market. There's not a definitively right answer here, so it's okay that you might not immediately feel like you know the perfect answer, but I would like you to write a couple sentences about what you think about this. So please pause this presentation now, enter in your information, and when you're ready, come back and move on. So a couple thoughts about creating a market versus targeting an existing market. If your idea is innovative enough, you might be able to create an entirely new market. And there can be some big advantages to this. You might have a first mover advantage over competitors. You may be able to create brand power and, at least initially, have some potentially high profit margins. It's really important to note, however, that none of these are necessarily long-term advantages. We'll talk more about first mover advantage later on in the course, but it's really important to recognize that this is not necessarily a long-term advantage. There are some disadvantages to creating a market. It can be quite difficult to conduct market research. In other words, it's very difficult to collect information from customers about what they want if they've never seen anything like your product or service before. You may have to spend a lot of money to educate customers about exactly why they should use your product or service. And there's also a high risk of getting it wrong simply because your information is extremely limited and you don't quite know what customers are going to do. Targeting a current market is how most businesses function. They usually approach this with an incremental improvement, or they further segment an already segmented market to provide a more specific niche product or service. So this can be a very effective way to enter the market. There are some things you want to watch out for when you're targeting a current market. Number one, the idea that you can sell to everyone. This is a common problem that entrepreneurs run into because they feel as if their product or service would be perfect for absolutely everyone in a potential market. And that's really, really unlikely. It does happen, but it's pretty unusual. And if you're talking to investors, you don't want to start with this assumption. The second mistake that entrepreneurs often make is what's referred to in the book as China syndrome, which is this idea that the target market is so enormous you only have to capture a tiny small percentage of it in order to be successful. This is a highly problematic approach, and investors hate it. So be very careful if you're going to make this suggestion in a pitch deck, because investors will jump all over this. Why? Well, let's take a look at how we might think about it. Let's think about the T-shirt project. You might, if you were trying to do a market estimate, say to yourself, well, there's 40,000 students and maybe they buy 8 T-shirts a year and presumably we could charge about $15 a shirt. Holy cow, this is a $5 million a year market. So if we only captured 1% of that, that's $48,000 a year. This is fantastic. We're going to be rich, right? And this sounds good the first time through, and entrepreneurs often get very, very excited about it. But there are a couple of really critical questions. We can argue about the actual numbers, what, maybe 8 t-shirts a year is too many, obviously, but and maybe $15 a t-shirt's too low. But there's an absolutely essential assumption in here, which is highly problematic, which is, why 1%? Why is it that 1% of all students are going to buy all their t-shirts from us? Why isn't this number 0% or 50%? This is called top-down analysis, and it's almost always wrong. Now, if you have no idea about your market, you might want to start with something like this, but be very, very careful, because once you get these kinds of ideas in your mind, it can be tough to get them out again, and no serious investor or business person will be able to pass this by without criticizing it. So as we think about segments, we want to think about why they make purchases and target them effectively. So if you take a marketing class or a market research course, you'll learn that there's a variety of different ways to describe segment characteristics. The most common are demographic or geographic, things like age and gender and occupation and family life cycle, education, or geographic, where you're based, what city, what state, whether you're urban or rural. There are also psychographic characteristics, some aspects of personality attributes or motives or lifestyles, and all of these can be useful. But ultimately, what really drives segments is their behaviors. Now, some of these behavioristic characteristics here are important that are described here, whether people are brand loyal or price sensitive. But ultimately, what we really want to understand is how they make decisions and why they make decisions. Realistically, true segments are determined by behavior. So we can think about issues like age, location, and income, but if we can't focus in on their behavioral choices, then we're going to still have a lot of difficulty in grouping potential customers together. This is the definition we want to use. A target customer segment is a group of potential customers who share characteristics and who would all have similar reasons to buy a particular product. So another way to think about this is, if you put a product in front of two potential customers and they choose to buy it for the same reasons, then they're in the same customer segment. If you put it in front of them and one of them buys it and one of them does not, and they have different reasons for how they made their choices, then they're probably not in the same customer segment. So let's try a little example of this. In Canvas, the next question is, who are the most likely target customers for whatever t-shirt you produce? Take a moment to write down 2 types of customers. I'm not concerned about whether you identify different segments or whatever, but just try to imagine at least 2 types of customers that you think are the most likely targets for your t-shirt. So take a moment, pause this presentation, come back when you've entered that information in. So the odds are pretty good that the people most likely to buy your t-shirts fall into 2 types. One of them are your family members, and they're probably in this kind of age range. They're at least one of them is probably employed, and they probably don't live in Madison. On the other hand, a second group of people who are likely to buy your t-shirts are probably your friends. They're probably much younger than your parents. They're probably students, and many of them probably live in Madison or wherever location you're based. So here we have 2 types of people who are different age, different income, different family life cycle position, different location, different characteristics, and yet realistically they're probably in the same market segment. And the reason is because they probably like you. And if you ask them to buy a shirt, it's quite likely they might. Otherwise, these people might have very little in common, but their behavior is likely to be the same because of their relationship with you. And so this is an example of realizing that a customer segment really is driven by behavior, these deep behavioral elements, not just these traditional age, income, socio-demographic kinds of characteristics. So please try to keep that in mind. So from here, please move on to the next set of presentations. We'll continue this conversation.